Her stepfather sold her to a rich old man, thinking he was getting rid of an unwanted burden. She prepared for the worst, but what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and post in the comments where you're watching from. The house had never been silent before. Even in the quietest hours of the night, there was always the soft murmur of her mother's voice. The rustling of fabric as she moved through the halls, the faint hum of a lullaby meant only for her daughter. Now, the silence was absolute, suffocating in its finality. The walls, which once felt like a sanctuary, had become a prison, and the girl who once believed she had time to grow, to dream, to escape, now realized that time had never belonged to her. She sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the thin blanket as if it could hold her together. The room smelled faintly of her mother's perfume, though it had begun to fade, just as her voice had faded in those last days when illness stole her breath. She had watched helplessly as the woman who had shielded her from the worst of the world grew weaker, her hands colder, her eyes dimmer. The fever had taken everything, her warmth, her strength, her life, and left her daughter behind in the hands of a man who never wanted her. He had never hit her, never raised his voice, but his cruelty was in the way he looked at her, or rather, the way he didn't. As though she was invisible. As though she was nothing. Before, when her mother was alive, she had convinced herself that his indifference was something she could tolerate. He wasn't kind, but he wasn't a monster either. He had fed them, clothed them, kept a roof over their heads. That had to count for something, didn't it? But now, with her mother gone, the truth stood bare before her. He hadn't done any of it for them. He had done it for the image, the illusion of a respectable man, a generous husband. And now that the one thing tying him to that illusion was dead, he had no need to pretend any more. The day after the funeral, the house changed. Her mother's things disappeared. Her dresses no longer hung in the wardrobe. Her favorite chair was gone from the sitting room, her photographs removed from the walls. It was as if she had never existed, as if he had erased her with the same cold efficiency with which he had handled the burial arrangements. The girl had tried to fight it at first, tried to hold on to the remnants of her mother's presence, but her defiance was met with nothing but a stare so empty it chilled her to the bone. "This is my house," he had said. "You will live in it by my rules. If you don't like them, you're free to leave." It was a cruel joke. He knew she had nowhere to go. Days passed in silence. She was not given food unless she asked, and even then the portions were small. Her room, once warm, became cold and bare. Her school books were gone. There was no need for them anymore, he had told her. She wouldn't be continuing her education. She spent her days wandering the house, careful to avoid him. She had never been allowed to speak too much in his presence, but now even her footsteps felt like a transgression. The air in the house grew heavier with something unspoken, something waiting, lurking. And then, one evening, the waiting ended. She was called downstairs, her name spoken without warmth, without familiarity. When she entered the room, he was not alone. A man sat in the chair opposite him, older, dressed in fine clothes, his face weathered but unreadable. He was watching her. She hesitated at the door, something inside her screaming at her to turn and run, though she had nowhere to run to. Her stepfather gestured for her to come forward. She obeyed. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the older man spoke. "So, this is the girl." Not his girl, not his stepdaughter, just the girl. Her stomach clenched and she turned to her stepfather. His expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp and calculating. "I've made arrangements for you," he said. She did not understand at first. Arrangements for what? "You'll be leaving tomorrow," he continued. Leaving? She hadn't asked to leave. She had nothing, but at least here, she still had her mother's memory. The walls that had once held laughter, the echoes of a life that was no longer hers. "I don't understand." Her voice was barely a whisper. The older man stood, brushing non-existent dust from his sleeve. "You don't have to." Something inside her broke. "I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, her stepfather's lips curled into something that resembled a smile, but it held no warmth, no amusement. "You don't have a choice." She turned to the door, to the hallway beyond it, to the stairs that led to her room, to the window she could climb out of if she ran fast enough, but the older man only shook his head. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, girl. Tomorrow." She had until tomorrow. She spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her chest. She thought about her mother, about what she would have done, what she would have said. She thought about her father, who had died before she could truly know him. She thought about the version of herself that had once dreamed of something more than this house, this town, this life. Morning came too soon. She wasn't given time to pack. There was nothing to pack. Her stepfather did not say goodbye. He did not watch as she was led out of the house and into the waiting car. She did not look back. The man who now owned her did not speak much on the drive, and when he did, his words were clipped, emotionless. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will do as you are told. You belong to me now." She wanted to scream, to cry, to fight, but she did none of those things. Instead, she stared out of the window, watching as the streets she had known all her life faded into the distance, swallowed by the horizon. The road stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of gray winding through the landscape, carrying her further and further away from everything she had ever known. Trees blurred past the window, their dark silhouettes bending beneath the weight of the overcast sky. The air inside the car was heavy, suffocating in its silence. The man sitting beside her did not speak, did not even glance in her direction, as if she were no more significant than the seat beneath him. She had not asked where they were going. It did not matter. Wherever it was not home. Her hands were clenched in her lap, nails digging into the fabric of her dress, the only thing she had left. It was too thin for the season, offering little protection from the chill that seeped through the cracks of the car's frame. She shivered, but she would not ask for warmth. She would not give him the satisfaction of knowing she needed anything from him. Time stretched in endless, agonizing minutes. The road turned from pavement to gravel, the tires crunching beneath them like breaking bones. She stole a glance at the driver. His hands were steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he carried himself, calm, detached, as if this were nothing more than routine. Perhaps it was. Perhaps he had done this before, escorted others to their fate with the same unwavering indifference. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She would not break, not yet. When the car finally slowed, her pulse quickened. The trees parted to reveal a long driveway leading up to a massive estate, its grand facade looming against the darkening sky. The windows, tall and narrow, stared down at her like watchful eyes, indifferent to her fear. The car came to a stop in front of the entrance, and for a moment, no one moved. The engine hummed beneath them, the only sound in the vast emptiness. Then the driver stepped out, walking around to open the door on her side. She hesitated. The man beside her did not move, did not acknowledge her at all, as if she were no longer his concern. A cold wind rushed in as the door opened, biting at her skin. She forced herself to step out, her legs trembling beneath her, though she willed them steady. The ground was hard beneath her feet, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her shoulders. She turned her gaze to the house, to the heavy wooden doors that stood closed before her. Somewhere beyond them, he was waiting. The man who now owned her. A voice inside her whispered that she should run, that she should turn and bolt into the trees, disappear into the wilderness before it was too late. But she knew better. There would be no escape. Not yet. The doors opened before she could summon the courage to move. A figure stood in the entryway, tall and imposing. For a fleeting moment, she thought it might be him, but then the figure stepped aside, and she realized it was merely a servant, someone who had been waiting for her arrival. Her stomach twisted. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the unknown. The air inside was warmer, but it did not comfort her. The walls were lined with paintings, old and regal, their subjects staring down at her with hollow eyes. The floor beneath her feet gleamed in the dim light of the chandeliers overhead. Everything about this place spoke of wealth, of power, of something far beyond her understanding. She had never belonged less. Footsteps echoed in the vast space, slow and deliberate. She turned her head just as a man entered the room. He was older than she expected, though not ancient. His hair was dark with streaks of silver at the temples, his face lined but strong. There was no warmth in his eyes, but neither was there cruelty. He studied her with an expression she could not decipher, as if measuring her worth with nothing more than a glance. She held her breath, waiting. "You must be her," he said at last, his voice low, steady. She did not answer. She did not know if she was allowed to. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he turned to the man who had brought her. "She looks younger than I expected." The other man shrugged. "She is what was promised." A chill ran down her spine. She was not a person to them. She was an object, a transaction. The older man studied her again, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, something unreadable, something she could not name. Then he nodded. Fine. With that, the deal was done. The man who had brought her left without another word, and just like that, she was alone. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. She expected him to command her, to tell her what was expected of her, to take what was now his by right of purchase. But he did none of those things. Instead, he stepped past her, moving toward the grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. "You will not be a prisoner here," he said without turning. "Not unless you make yourself one." She blinked, uncertain if she had heard him correctly. "You will have your own room. You will be given everything you need. I have no interest in controlling you." She could not speak. "I bought you because I knew what would happen if I did not. Do not mistake me for a kind man, but neither am I a monster." Her heart pounded in her chest. She did not understand. "I suggest you rest. Tomorrow we will talk." With that, he disappeared up the stairs, leaving her standing alone in the vast, unfamiliar space. She did not move for a long time. She had prepared herself for suffering, for captivity, for cruelty. She had not prepared for this. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the hour, the chime echoing through the empty halls. Tomorrow. She did not know what it would bring, but for the first time since she had stepped into that car, she felt something stir inside her. Not hope, not yet, but something close. She did not sleep that night, even after she was shown to her room, a space far larger than anything she'd ever called her own. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The bed beneath her was too soft, the sheets too smooth. Everything about this place felt foreign, unfamiliar, too grand for someone like her. It was not a home, not yet, and she was uncertain if it ever would be. She could still hear the echoes of his voice, his words looping in her mind. "I have no interest in controlling you." She could not reconcile that statement with what she had been expecting. Her entire body had been braced for the worst, for chains, for cold hands and harsher orders. But none of that had come. Instead, he had simply told her to rest. She did not trust it. Morning arrived too quickly. The golden light of the sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the room. The silence of the house was unsettling, too vast, too hollow. She had expected footsteps outside her door, expected a summons or a command, but none came. It was as if she had been left alone entirely. Hesitantly, she rose from the bed, her bare feet sinking into the thick carpet. A large wardrobe stood against the wall, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, she found clothes, none of them hers, but all perfectly her size. Dresses of fine material, blouses softer than anything she had ever worn. She hesitated before choosing something simple, something that made her feel as though she was not playing dress-up in someone else's life. The hallway outside her room was eerily quiet. She moved carefully, half expecting to be stopped, to be reminded that she was not truly free here. But the house remained indifferent to her presence. The walls were lined with paintings, men and women with solemn faces, their expressions locked in time. She did not know who they were, did not care to know. They were ghosts of a history that did not belong to her. She found the dining room by accident. The table stretched long, its surface polished to perfection. At the far end, he sat, sipping from a cup of dark liquid, his expression unreadable as he watched her step hesitantly inside. "You're awake," he said simply, setting his cup down. She did not answer. A servant appeared beside her, silent and efficient, gesturing for her to take a seat. She hesitated before obeying, her movements slow, deliberate. She had spent her life being told what to do, but now, in this place, the absence of orders felt just as suffocating as their presence. A plate of food was placed before her. She stared at it for a moment before glancing at him. "Eat," he said, as if the word itself was foreign to her. She had not realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite. The food was rich, heavier than what she was used to, but she did not let herself think too much about it. He did not speak as she ate. He simply watched, his gaze steady but not intrusive. She did not know what to make of him. He was not cruel, not yet, but neither did he seem particularly kind. There was a weight to him, an unreadable depth in his posture, in the way he carried himself. When she had finished, he finally broke the silence. "I suppose you have questions." She did, 1,000 of them, but none of them found their way past her lips. He studied her for a moment before continuing. "I bought you because I could," he said, as if that alone was enough explanation. "Because I knew what would happen to you otherwise." She stiffened. "You expected something worse." It was not a question. She did not answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. His expression did not change. If anything, there was a flicker of something almost resembling amusement in his eyes. "I do not need a servant," he said. "I do not need a wife. I do not need anything that you might have assumed." Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table. "Then why?" she forced herself to ask. A long pause, then, because you deserved better than what was planned for you. She did not know what to do with that. No one had ever told her she deserved anything before. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I have given you a house, a name, money to start anew. What you do with it is your choice. Her heart pounded in her chest. You will not keep me here? His lips twitched into something that was almost a smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. You are not a prisoner, he said simply. She could not breathe. For so long, she had prepared for the worst. She had steeled herself against the reality that her life was no longer her own. And yet, here he was, handing it back to her. She did not trust it, could not trust it, but still, the possibility of something else, something more than just survival, was there, lingering just beyond reach. He pushed a small envelope across the table toward her. She stared at it before hesitantly picking it up. Inside were papers, documents, proof of ownership for a house, an account with enough money to sustain her for years. She felt sick. This is not a gift, he said, his voice softer now. It is a chance. A chance for what, she did not know. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the envelope down. If you leave, you will not return here, he continued. That is the only condition. She swallowed hard. Take your time to decide. He stood then, his presence as steady as ever, before turning toward the door. She sat frozen as his footsteps faded down the hall. The papers remained in front of her, a silent promise of something she had never dared to hope for. Freedom. But what did freedom mean when she had never known it? What did it mean to have choices when all she had ever known was obedience? She did not know, but for the first time in her life she had the power to find out. The envelope remained in front of her long after he had left. She traced the edges with her fingertips, feeling the weight of the paper, the silent authority it carried. It was more than just documents. It was proof that she had been given something she had never possessed before, a choice, a life of her own. She had thought she would feel relief, maybe even joy, but all she felt was fear. What did it mean to be free when she had never known anything but ownership? Could someone who had never been allowed to decide for herself suddenly be expected to shape her own future? The very idea made her stomach twist. She left the dining room without touching the envelope again. It followed her in her mind, a shadow lingering behind every step she took as she wandered the halls of the grand house. It still did not feel like hers, despite what the document said. She moved carefully, always bracing for the moment someone would remind her she did not belong. But no one did. No one stopped her. No one questioned her presence. It was as if she were a ghost drifting through rooms that had already accepted her as part of them. She found a small library tucked away in the east wing. The walls were lined with books that smelled of old paper and ink, of knowledge she had never been allowed to claim for herself. She ran her fingers along the spines, reading the titles, some in languages she could not understand. She had always wanted to learn. She had wanted many things, but those wants had always been luxuries beyond her reach. Now they were not. The realization made her hands tremble. A servant found her there hours later, informing her that a carriage was waiting for her outside. The man, her supposed benefactor, had arranged everything. The house that was now hers, the money she could withdraw whenever she needed, the transportation to take her away from here and into the unknown. She did not say anything as she followed the servant back through the halls. Her footsteps felt heavier with every step, as if something inside her was trying to root her in place. She had prepared herself for captivity, for suffering, for anything but this. And now, standing at the open door with the carriage waiting before her, she felt like she was stepping off the edge of a cliff. The man was there, standing beside the driver, watching her with that same unreadable expression. He did not speak, did not offer any final words of wisdom or comfort. He simply inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her decision before stepping aside. She climbed into the carriage. The door closed behind her. The wheels began to turn. The estate disappeared behind the trees. She had left. She sat rigidly as the city came into view, watching the buildings rise and stretch towards the sky. It was a world she had never been a part of, one she had only seen from a distance, always knowing it was not for her. But now it was hers to navigate. The house was waiting for her when she arrived. It was smaller than the estate, but still grand by her standards, more space than she knew what to do with. A stranger's house that now belonged to her. She stood at the threshold for a long time before stepping inside. The air smelled different. Not like dust or dampness, but like something new. Like the start of something that did not yet have a shape. She moved slowly through the rooms, running her fingers along the surfaces, feeling the smooth wood of the banister, the cool glass of the windows. Everything was untouched, waiting for her. The first night was the hardest. She lay awake in the vast, empty space, listening to the silence pressing in around her. There were no voices drifting through the halls, no presence to remind her she was not alone. For the first time, she was entirely by herself. No stepfather watching her with disdain, no benefactor offering her cryptic words of advice. She was free, and it terrified her. Days passed in slow, quiet motions. She moved through the house like a stranger, eating because she had to, sleeping because her body demanded it. She had no obligations, no one telling her what to do or where to go. And yet, she still felt the invisible chains of habit, the weight of a lifetime spent waiting for orders. She forced herself to step outside. The city was unfamiliar, the streets winding in ways she did not understand. People moved around her with purpose, their conversations a blur of voices she did not belong to. She kept her head down, her shoulders tense, afraid someone would recognize that she was out of place. But no one did. She was invisible. The thought unsettled her. She had spent so long being controlled, watched, owned. Now she was just another person in a sea of strangers, and she did not know how to exist like that. She found a bookshop near the marketplace, drawn to the rows of worn pages and quiet solitude. She had never been allowed to own books before, to read for the sake of learning rather than instruction. The idea of choosing one for herself felt strange, almost rebellious. She bought 3. The shopkeeper did not question her. He took her money, handed her the wrapped parcels, and moved on to the next customer. It was such a simple exchange, and yet it made something tighten in her chest. She could do this. She could learn. She could become someone else. She spent weeks exploring the city in small steps. She learned the streets, the hidden alleyways, the places where people gathered. She listened to conversations in cafes, absorbing their words, their mannerisms. She took notes in the margins of her books, filling the empty spaces with thoughts she had never dared to voice before. She was learning how to live. She visited the university one evening, standing at the gates as students passed through, their laughter and debates filling the air. She had dreamed of this once, back when dreams had been nothing more than fragile things easily broken. Now, She could have it. The realization sent a thrill through her veins. She enrolled in courses. The process was more daunting than she had expected, requiring paperwork she had never had before, questions she did not know how to answer. But she found a way. She learned how to navigate the system, how to present herself as someone who belonged. It was not easy. There were setbacks, failures, moments where she wanted to retreat back into the safety of her quiet house. But she did not. She kept going. She built something, piece by piece. By the time a year had passed, she was no longer the girl who had sat in that carriage, terrified of the future stretching before her. She was someone else now, stronger, wiser. She had a life of her own, and for the first time she was not afraid of it. She no longer hesitated when she stepped out onto the streets. The fear of being seen, of being recognized as someone who did not belong, had begun to fade. She had spent too much time hiding, shrinking, waiting for permission to exist. Now she walked with purpose. The city had become a part of her. Its noise and movement no longer overwhelming, but familiar, like the steady rhythm of something alive. The air smelled of fresh bread from the bakeries, of ink and paper from the bookshops she frequented, of rain on stone after the evening showers. The streets were still strange in some ways, but they no longer felt like a maze meant to trap her. They were paths she could choose for herself. Her studies consumed most of her days. She had entered the university quietly, without fanfare or notice, just another student among many. The weight of expectation was hers alone to carry, and that, more than anything, had been the greatest shift. No one told her what she could or could not do. No one dictated her path. For the first time in her life, her success, or her failure, belonged only to her. The work was harder than she had anticipated. Though she had always been eager to learn, she had never been given the foundation that so many of her classmates took for granted. She spent long hours in the library poring over textbooks, filling notebooks with equations and theories, pushing herself to absorb knowledge as quickly as possible. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. She was proving, to herself more than to anyone else, that she could do this. Her professors noticed her determination. Some admired it, offering quiet encouragement when they saw her staying late in the lecture halls, rereading the same passages until they made sense. Others were indifferent, treating her as they did any other student. That, in itself, was a victory. To be seen as equal. To be expected to succeed rather than assumed to fail. The first time she spoke up in a discussion, her voice was steady despite the nervous knot in her stomach. The room had been filled with voices, opinions thrown across the space like weapons, ideas clashing in a battle of intellect. She had hesitated at first, but then something inside her refused to stay silent. She had spoken, her words sharp and deliberate, her argument well-formed. And they had listened. Not out of politeness, not out of obligation. They had listened because she had something to say. She carried that moment with her for days. But not everything was easy. There were still moments of doubt when exhaustion made her question if she had made the right choice, if she truly belonged here. There were days when she caught herself shrinking again, when she felt the familiar pull of the past trying to drag her back into silence. And there were those who did not want her to succeed. It started subtly, whispers in the halls, eyes lingering on her too long, expressions shifting when they realized who she was, or rather who she was not. A girl without a family name, without the proper background, without the right to be among them. At first, she ignored it. She had dealt with worse. But then came the notes left on her desk, the quiet laughter when she entered a room, the assignments that mysteriously disappeared from her file. One evening, she found ink spilled across her notebook, the carefully written pages ruined. She stared at the mess for a long moment, the weight of it pressing against her ribs. She could have let it break her. She almost did. But then she thought of the man who had given her the choice to be here, the chance to carve out a life beyond what had been decided for her. She thought of the nights she had spent awake, fighting to learn, to understand, to catch up to those who had never had to fight for their education. And she thought of herself, the girl who had been bought and sold, the girl who had been told her fate was not hers to decide. She was not that girl anymore. The next day, she arrived early. She sat in the front row. She asked questions. She spoke louder. She would not disappear. The small acts of cruelty did not stop entirely, but they lessened. Some of them lost interest when they realized she would not break. Others, she suspected, began to respect her. One afternoon, a classmate approached her, a young woman with sharp eyes and an easy smile. She had never spoken to her before, had always been among the ones who watched but never acted. "You're braver than they are," the woman had said simply before handing her a fresh notebook. It was the first act of kindness she had received in a long time, and she did not take it for granted. Slowly, things changed. She began to make connections, friendships built on mutual respect rather than obligation. She was no longer just the girl who did not belong. She was a student, a competitor, an equal. Her work improved. She earned the highest marks in her courses, not because she was the smartest, but because she was relentless. She refused to fail. Her business, the one she had started quietly with the money she had been given, began to grow. It had started small, consulting, helping with marketing strategies, using what she had learned to create something sustainable. It was difficult at first, but she learned quickly. She adapted, and soon people noticed. Her name began to carry weight in circles that had once ignored her. Companies reached out, investors showed interest. She was building something, and for the first time it was truly hers. A year passed, then another. She no longer flinched when someone spoke her name. She no longer feared the weight of expectations. She was not just surviving, she was thriving, and she had done it on her own. She had learned how to navigate this world. It no longer felt like something foreign, something she was trespassing in. She had made a place for herself, carved it out with her own hands, with her own will. The city no longer swallowed her whole. It bent around her, molding itself to fit the person she had become. She had built a name for herself, not just within the university, but beyond it. Her business had grown steadily, turning from a small consulting endeavor into something far more significant. She had clients who respected her, who sought her expertise, not because they pitied her or because they were obligated to, but because she was good at what she did. The independence she had once feared now felt like the most natural thing in the world. She made decisions for herself. She set her own path. And then, one evening, the past came knocking. It was late when she returned home, the weight of a long day settling into her bones. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain, though the storm had not yet arrived. She had stopped noticing how quiet her house was. It had once been suffocating, but now it was a comfort, a space that was entirely hers. She had just set down her bag when she heard it. A knock at the door. She paused. Few people ever came to her house unannounced. Those who mattered to her knew to send word before arriving. and there was something about the sound, firm, expectant, that sent a shiver down her spine. She moved towards the door, her steps slow, measured. Something in her already knew. Some deep, unspoken part of her had always known this moment would come. When she pulled the door open, the sight before her was both unfamiliar and painfully known. Her stepfather stood on her doorstep. The years had not been kind to him. His face was thinner than she remembered, the sharpness of his features now exaggerated by the lines of age and bitterness. His clothes, once carefully maintained, were worn, as if he no longer cared to keep up appearances. But his eyes were exactly the same. Cold, calculating. She did not speak. For a moment, neither of them did. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, filled with all the things that had never been said. Then he smiled. It was a poor imitation of warmth, a mask he had never worn well. "You've done well for yourself," he said. Her grip tightened on the door. She felt the old instincts creeping back, the urge to shrink, to make herself smaller, to avoid his gaze. But she forced herself to stand tall. She was not that girl anymore. She did not return his smile. "What do you want?" He raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Is that any way to greet family?" The word sent a cold rush through her veins. "You sold me," she said. His expression did not change. "And yet, here you are, thriving. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word lodged itself in her throat like something poisonous. She could have laughed. She should have slammed the door in his face. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she watched him. She saw the way his eyes flickered past her shoulder, taking in the interior of her house, the subtle way his fingers curled as if itching to take something that wasn't his. And then she understood. You need money. It wasn't a question. His expression tightened for the briefest moment before the mask returned. "Is that what you think?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "I came to see how you were. I came because I wanted to make things right." A hollow, empty lie. She had spent years waiting for an apology that would never come. She had given up on it long ago. She could have told him how much she had suffered. She could have made him hear every detail, every moment of pain, every ounce of fear. But he wouldn't have cared. Instead, she gave him the one thing he never expected: indifference. "You should leave," she said simply. She saw the flicker of anger in his gaze. He had expected something else: guilt, hesitation, weakness. He found none of it. "You wouldn't even be here if it weren't for me," he said, his voice lower now, edged with something sharp. She tilted her head slightly, considering him. "You're right," she said. "If it weren't for you, I would still be trapped in that house. I would still be afraid. I would still be waiting for someone else to decide my fate." Her gaze did not waver. "But I'm not that girl anymore, and I don't owe you anything." For the first time, something in his expression cracked. She did not wait for him to respond. She stepped back and closed the door. The finality of it echoed through her chest. She stood there for a long moment, her breath slow, steady, and then she turned away. The past had come for her, and she had shut it out, for good. She did not expect him to return so soon, but she should have known better. Men like him did not accept rejection. They did not take silence as an answer. They took. They demanded. And when they found resistance, they pushed harder. The first time had been a test, she realized. He had wanted to see how much of the old girl still remained in her, whether she would hesitate, whether she would give in. And when she had closed the door in his face, she had given him his answer. She was no longer afraid of him. That should have been enough to make him leave. But men like him did not know how to walk away empty-handed. She was at her desk when she heard the knock again, days after their last encounter. This time it was louder, heavier. A demand, not a request. She didn't move at first, didn't breathe, just sat there staring at the closed door, listening to the silence that followed. Then another knock. She exhaled slowly and rose to her feet. When she opened the door, she was not surprised to see him standing there. But this time, he was not alone. A woman stood beside him, younger than him but with the same hardness in her expression. His new wife, she guessed, the replacement. She had never seen the woman before, but she knew her kind. The kind who latched on to men like him, not because they were blind to what they were, but because they thought they could benefit from it. The woman's gaze flickered over her, taking her in, measuring, calculating. She held her ground. "You didn't think we were finished, did you?" her stepfather said, his voice too smooth, too assured. She didn't flinch. "You need something," she said. His smile was sharp, pleased. "We all need something." He shifted, stepping closer as if he expected her to let him in. She didn't move. "You owe me," he said. There it was. The words he had wanted to say all along. She could have laughed if it weren't so pathetic. "I owe you nothing." His smile didn't falter, but there was something behind it now, something harder. "You would be nothing without me," he said. "I gave you a life. You wouldn't have survived if it weren't for me. And now you have more than you need. It's only right you give back." She stared at him, at the arrogance, at the absolute conviction that he still had power over her. The past stirred in her memory, sharp and vivid. The years of silence, of fear, of knowing that she was only tolerated because she was too young to be thrown away. The moment he had taken her life into his hands and sold it without hesitation. He had expected her to remain broken. And now, standing in front of him, whole, unshaken, she could see that he hated it. "You sold me," she said, her voice even. His smile faltered. "You didn't care where I ended up. You didn't care if I lived or died. And now you think you have the right to ask for something from me?" She shook her head. "You didn't give me a life. I built this myself, and you will get nothing from it." His face darkened. The woman beside him tensed, shifting as if preparing for a fight. But she wasn't the one who mattered. She kept her gaze on him. "This is the last time we will speak," she said. "If you ever come back, if you ever try to take anything from me again, I will make sure you regret it." His jaw clenched. For the first time, she saw something almost like uncertainty in his eyes. "Good." She stepped back and, with steady hands, closed the door in his face. This time, she knew he would not return. And if he did, he would not like what he found. She stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, waiting for something, some old fear, some lingering doubt to resurface. But it never did. She had won. Not just against him, but against everything he had once made her believe about herself. She was free. And this time, it was forever. The door remained closed long after he was gone. She stood there for a while, waiting, listening, as if expecting the past to reach through the wood and drag her back. But there was nothing. No footsteps lingering on the other side. No second knock demanding her attention. Just silence. It was over. The realization came slowly, unfurling in her chest like something unfamiliar. It did not arrive with a dramatic crash, no grand moment of celebration. She turned away, moving through the house that belonged to her and no one else. For so long, she had been bracing for this, for the inevitable return of the past. And now that it had come and gone, now that she had faced it and closed the door, she did not know what to do with the space it left behind. For years, every decision she had made had been shaped by survival. Even when she had stepped into freedom, even when she had built her own life, there had always been a shadow lingering at the edges of it. She had been waiting for the moment someone would come to take it away, but no one was coming. She exhaled slowly, as if for the first time in years she could finally breathe without fear. The city stretched beyond her window, its lights flickering against the dark sky. It had once been foreign to her, something vast and unknowable. Now it was home. She had made it so. Her business continued to grow, stronger now than ever before. The weight of uncertainty had faded, replaced by something steadier, something unshakable. She no longer worked out of fear, no longer fought simply to prove she belonged. She knew she did. She expanded, taking on new projects, making connections she once never would have dreamed of. People respected her, sought her out for her skill, her knowledge. She was not an anomaly, not a charity case. She was a force of her own making, and she was not alone. The friendships she had formed in the university had not faded with time. The people who had once been distant classmates were now part of her life in ways she had never anticipated. They were colleagues, partners, friends who knew her not as the girl who had been sold, but as the woman who had built something out of nothing. She no longer feared the quiet moments. She no longer filled them with ghosts of the past, with what-ifs and doubts. She no longer flinched at the sound of footsteps behind her, no longer waited for the inevitable collapse of the life she had created. One evening, as she stood in the doorway of her office, looking out at the city she had claimed as her own, she realized something she had never dared to hope for. She was happy. Not in the way she had once imagined happiness, soft and fleeting, something given and easily taken away, but in a way that was steady, unshakable. She was at peace. She had won, and the life before her belonged only to her. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming content. Check out our other videos for more stories, and don't forget to share this video with others. See you next time.